In this hollow, the Wright clan lived for generations, and here in 1892, Lawmen pressed a father until he broke. They took what he loved most, to get what they wanted most, his own.
Kentucky Ghost, Devil John Wright, who killed 18 lawmen after they made him turn against his own clan. The deadliest betrayal in Appalachian history and the most ruthless campaign of vengeance the Kentucky mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of Devil John Wright. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Letcher County, Kentucky, known simply as the Kingdom. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into rifle fire. Hemmed in by the ancient Pine Mountains, the early settlers who lived along the Kentucky River and its countless tributaries were cut off from the outside world, and for over 200 years each succeeding generation remained that way. There were no telephones and the roads were few, and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most lawless and impenetrable sections in all of America. From the early period when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up until the 20th century, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This, no doubt, has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. And during the 1800s and even well into the 1900s, most of the region's inhabitants were members of extended family clans who lived according to ancient codes of loyalty and honor. Schools and churches were few and far between. In fact, most children didn't even attend school, and those that did rarely did so for more than just a few months a year. The people of these hills had developed their own way of living, their own understanding of justice, and their own absolute commitment to blood and kin. You see, in these mountains, clan loyalty was not merely a preference, but a sacred obligation that superseded every other consideration. A man's clan was his identity, his protection, his entire world. The clan provided for its members in times of need, defended them against enemies, and avenged them when they were wronged. To betray one's clan was the most unforgivable sin imaginable, worse than murder, worse than any crime the outside world could name. A man who turned against his own blood was considered dead, even while he still drew breath, his name erased from family memory, his existence denied by everyone who had once loved him. The Wright clan had dominated the upper reaches of the Kentucky River for as long as anyone could remember, their ancestors among the first white settlers to push into this wilderness after the Revolutionary War. They had fought the Shawnee and the Cherokee, had carved homesteads out of virgin forest, had survived winters that would have killed lesser people. By the early 1900s, the Wrights numbered over 300 souls spread across a dozen hollers, all of them bound together by blood and marriage, and a shared history of survival against impossible odds. They were not wealthy by any outside measure, but they were powerful in the only way that mattered in these mountains. They had each other. That's right. The Wright clan was led in 1909 by a patriarch named Ezekiel Wright, a man of 73 years who had survived the Civil War, 3 blood feuds, and the deaths of 2 wives and countless children and grandchildren. Ezekiel's word was law within the clan, his decisions final and unquestionable. He had led his people through decades of conflict with neighboring families and with the outside authorities who occasionally ventured into the kingdom to impose their version of order. Under his leadership, the Wrights had prospered and multiplied, their territory expanding to encompass some of the most valuable land in the county. Among Ezekiel's many grandchildren, one stood out above all the others. His name was John Wright, born in 1881, the son of Ezekiel's eldest son who had died in a mining accident when John was just 7 years old. John had been raised by his grandfather, trained in the old ways, groomed to eventually take his place as the leader of the clan. He was tall and strong, intelligent and resourceful, and he possessed a natural authority that made other men follow him without question. By the time he was 25, John Wright was already known throughout the county as a man not to be crossed, a reputation that would eventually earn him the nickname that would follow him to his grave. The nickname Devil John was not given lightly and was not entirely a compliment. It referred to the cold fury that John Wright could summon when provoked. a rage that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human emotion. Men who had seen him angry spoke of it in whispers, describing eyes that seemed to glow with an inner fire and a voice that dropped to a whisper more terrifying than any shout. John himself never used the nickname, but he did nothing to discourage it either. In these mountains, a fearsome reputation was worth more than gold, and John Wright's reputation was among the most fearsome of all. The origins of this reputation stretched back to John's youth, when he had first demonstrated the qualities that would define his later life. At the age of 16, he had tracked and killed a man who had cheated his grandfather in a livestock deal, following the man for 3 days through the mountains before catching up with him in a remote hollow. The killing was never officially investigated, but everyone in the county knew what had happened, and they drew the appropriate conclusions. John Wright was not a man who forgot a wrong, and he was not a man who forgave. By the time he was 20, John had established himself as the principal enforcer of Wright clan interests, the man who dealt with disputes that could not be resolved through negotiation or legal channels. He had killed at least 4 men by that age, though the exact number was known only to him and perhaps to his grandfather. Each killing had been justified by the clan's code of honor, each target someone who had wronged the family in ways that demanded blood payment. John performed these duties without apparent emotion, approaching them as tasks to be completed rather than acts of passion or revenge. His skills extended beyond mere violence to encompass the full range of abilities needed to lead a mountain clan. He was an expert tracker who could follow a trail that others would never even notice. He was a marksman whose accuracy with a rifle was legendary throughout the county. He was a strategist who could anticipate his enemy's moves and position his own forces to maximum advantage. And he was a leader whose quiet authority commanded respect from men twice his age. These qualities made him invaluable to the clan, and everyone understood that he would eventually succeed his grandfather as patriarch. The Wright compound where John lived occupied a broad hollow at the head of Kingdom Creek, a location that the clan had held since the first Wright ancestor arrived in Kentucky in 1792. The compound had grown over the generations, expanding from a single cabin to a complex of over 20 structures that housed the core of the clan leadership. There was a main house where Ezekiel Wright held court, smaller houses for his sons and their families, barns and smokehouses and workshops, and a small church where the clan gathered each Sunday to worship in their own way. The hollow was naturally defensible, with steep ridges on 3 sides that limited the approaches any enemy could use. The clan had improved on nature's defenses over the generations, establishing observation posts on the high ground, clearing fields of fire around the approaches, and developing signals that could alert the entire compound to danger within minutes. Any force attempting to attack the Wright compound would face obstacles that made success virtually impossible, a fact that had deterred potential enemies for over a century. Now, to understand what happened in 1909, you need to understand the forces that were pressing in on clans like the Wrights from all directions. That's right. The old ways of the mountains were under assault from a modern world that had no patience for family dynasties who refused to bow to outside authority. Coal companies wanted access to the mineral wealth that lay beneath Wright land. Railroad companies wanted rights of way through valleys that the clan had controlled for generations. And the state government, embarrassed by the lawlessness that seemed to define eastern Kentucky in the eyes of the nation, had launched a campaign to bring these mountain communities under proper control. The man charged with bringing order to Letcher County was a U.S. Marshal named Thomas Blackwood, a veteran lawman who had made his reputation in the Oklahoma Territory hunting outlaws across the Indian nations. Blackwood was 51 years old in 1909, a career officer who had never failed to bring in his quarry and who saw the Kentucky mountains as simply another frontier to be tamed. He arrived in the county seat of Whitesburg in March of that year, with a staff of 8 deputies and a mandate from the federal government to do whatever was necessary to establish the rule of law. What Blackwood did not understand, and what no outsider could truly understand, was the depth of the bonds that held mountain clans together. He saw the Wrights as criminals to be arrested, witnesses to be interrogated, a problem to be solved through the application of sufficient force. He did not see them as a family whose roots ran deeper than the mountains themselves, whose loyalty to each other was the only law they recognized. This blindness would lead him to make a decision that would result in the deaths of 18 men and would transform John Wright from a respected Klan leader into the most feared killer in Kentucky history. And that's when things got ugly. Because Thomas Blackwood decided that the key to breaking the Wright clan was to find someone on the inside, someone who could be pressured or persuaded to turn against his own blood. You see, the plan that Marshal Blackwood developed in the spring of 1909 was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of mountain culture. He believed that everyone had a price, that sufficient pressure would cause anyone to betray their loyalties, that the bonds of clan and family were merely sentimental attachments that would crumble when confronted with the hard realities of federal power. He had used this approach successfully in Oklahoma, turning gang members against each other by offering immunity to those who cooperated. He saw no reason why the same tactics would not work in Kentucky. The target he selected was a young man named William Wright, known to everyone as Billy, a second cousin of John Wright, who had recently gotten into trouble with the law. Billy was 22 years old and had been arrested for selling whiskey without a federal license, a minor offense that carried a maximum sentence of a few months in jail. But Blackwood saw in Billy's arrest an opportunity to achieve something much larger. He had Billy transferred to a federal facility in Lexington, away from the support of his family, and he began a campaign of pressure that would last for 3 brutal months. The tactics Blackwood used on Billy Wright would later become the subject of official investigation, though nothing ever came of it. Billy was held in solitary confinement for weeks at a time, locked in a cell so small that he could not fully extend his legs, denied adequate food and water, subjected to interrogation sessions that lasted for days without rest. The cell was in the basement of the federal facility, a place where no natural light ever reached, where the passage of time became impossible to track, where a man could lose his mind from sensory deprivation alone. The interrogators worked in shifts, ensuring that Billy never had a moment's peace. They woke him whenever he fell asleep, asked the same questions over and over, demanded answers that he could not give. They told him that his family had abandoned him, that the Wright clan had disavowed him, that no one was coming to help him, that his only hope of ever seeing freedom again was to cooperate with the federal authorities. When he insisted that he had nothing to tell them, they found ways to convince him otherwise. The physical abuse was systematic and deliberate, designed to break resistance without leaving marks that might cause problems later. Billy was forced to stand for days at a time, his ankles shackled to iron rings in the floor, denied the opportunity to sit or lie down until his legs gave out and he collapsed. He was subjected to extremes of temperature, left in rooms that were freezing cold or unbearably hot, his body pushed to the limits of what it could endure. He was denied medical attention when he fell ill, forced to suffer through fevers and infections that a simple doctor's visit could have cured. But the physical torment was only part of Blackwood's strategy. The psychological warfare was equally brutal and ultimately more effective. Billy was shown forged letters, supposedly from his wife, saying that she had given up on him, that she had found someone else, that she never wanted to see him again. He was told that his infant daughter did not recognize his name, that she was being raised to forget she ever had a father. Every vulnerability was identified and exploited, every attachment weaponized against him. He was threatened with transfer to a federal penitentiary, where Blackwood assured him mountain boys did not fare well. Blackwood described in graphic detail what happened to young men in those prisons, the violence and degradation that awaited anyone who entered without powerful protectors. He made clear that Billy's stay in the Lexington facility was merely a preview of horrors yet to come. That cooperation was the only path to avoiding a fate worse than death, and when these tactics failed to break him, Blackwood found other methods. The breaking point came when Blackwood threatened Billy's young wife and infant daughter, who were living with Billy's parents on Wright territory. Blackwood made clear that federal agents could find reasons to arrest virtually anyone, that charges could be fabricated if necessary, that Billy's wife could spend years in prison, and his daughter could be placed in an orphanage if Billy refused to cooperate. Whether Blackwood actually had the power to do these things was irrelevant. Billy believed him, and that belief destroyed the last of his resistance. Billy Wright agreed to become an informant, to provide the federal authorities with information about his clan's activities. to testify against his own family members if called upon to do so. In exchange, Blackwood promised that all charges against Billy would be dropped, that his wife and daughter would be left alone, and that Billy himself would be given safe passage out of Kentucky when his work was done. It was a devil's bargain, and Billy knew it even as he accepted it. But he saw no other way to protect the people he loved most, even if it meant betraying the people who had raised him. What Billy did not know was that John Wright had been monitoring the situation from the moment of Billy's arrest, using the clan's extensive network of contacts to track what was happening to their kinsman. John had tried to arrange Billy's release through legal channels, had hired lawyers and filed motions, and done everything the system supposedly allowed. When these efforts failed, he had begun planning a rescue, assembling a team that would intercept the prison transport and free Billy by force. But before that plan could be executed, word reached John that Billy had broken, that he was cooperating with the Federals, that he had become an informer against his own blood. The news struck John Wright like a physical blow, leaving him shaken in ways that few things ever had. Billy was family, a boy John had known since childhood, someone he had trusted and protected and expected to trust and protect in return. The idea that Billy had turned against the clan was almost impossible to accept, and yet the evidence was undeniable. Multiple sources confirmed that Billy was talking to the Federals, providing information about Wright activities, helping Blackwood build cases against clan members. The betrayal was real and it demanded a response, but John Wright was not a man who acted impulsively, regardless of the provocation. He spent 2 weeks gathering information, learning exactly what Billy had told the Federals and what Blackwood was planning to do with that information. He discovered that Billy's betrayal had not been willing but coerced, that Blackwood had used threats against Billy's wife and child to break his resistance. This did not excuse what Billy had done, but it complicated matters. The true enemy was not Billy, but the men who had forced him to betray his family, and those men would pay for what they had done. And that decision, made in a cabin deep in the Kentucky mountains, would result in one of the bloodiest vendettas in American history. You see, the problem John Wright faced was unprecedented in his experience. The clan's traditional response to betrayal was simple and final. The betrayer was killed, his name erased, his existence denied. But Billy's situation was different. Billy had not betrayed the clan willingly, but had been broken by men who used his love for his wife and daughter against him. To kill Billy would be to punish the victim rather than the perpetrator, and yet to let Billy's betrayal go unanswered would invite more of the same, would signal that the Wright clan could be broken by anyone willing to apply sufficient pressure. John wrestled with this dilemma for days, consulting with his grandfather Ezekiel and the other clan elders, seeking guidance from the traditions that had sustained his people for generations. The discussions were heated, with some arguing for Billy's immediate execution and others urging restraint. But gradually a consensus emerged. Billy had been weak, had failed in his duty to his clan, but he was not the true enemy. The true enemies were the federal marshals who had orchestrated his betrayal, who had used tactics of torture and intimidation to break a young man's will. Those men would face the clan's justice, and their punishment would serve as a warning to anyone who might consider similar tactics in the future. The plan that John Wright developed over the following weeks was methodical and comprehensive. He would not simply kill Thomas Blackwood, though Blackwood was certainly at the top of his list. He would destroy the entire federal operation in Letcher County, would eliminate every deputy who had participated in Billy's coercion, would make the cost of targeting the Wright clan so catastrophically high that no one would ever attempt it again. This was not mere vengeance, but strategic necessity, a demonstration of power that would secure the clan's position for generations to come. John gathered the elders of the clan to explain his plan and to secure their blessing for what he was about to do. The meeting took place in the main house of the compound, the same room where generations of Wright leaders had made the decisions that shaped the clan's destiny. John spoke for over an hour, laying out the situation in detail, explaining the threat that the federal presence represented, and describing the response he believed was necessary. When he finished, there was a long silence as the elders considered what they had heard. Ezekiel Wright spoke first, as was his right as patriarch. He was 93 years old now, his body failing but his mind still sharp. He asked John if he understood the consequences of what he was proposing, if he was prepared to spend the rest of his life as a hunted man, if he was willing to bring war to the clan's doorstep. John replied that he understood all of these things, that he had considered them carefully, and that he saw no alternative that would preserve the clan's honor and security. Ezekiel nodded slowly and gave his blessing. The other elders followed one by one, until the decision was unanimous. The first step was intelligence gathering. John sent trusted clan members to Whitesburg and beyond, tasking them with learning everything about the federal marshals stationed in the county. He wanted to know their names, their faces, their routines, their weaknesses. He wanted to know where they lived, where they ate, where they spent their off-duty hours. He wanted to know which ones were married and which ones had families nearby. Every detail might prove useful when the time came to strike. The clan's intelligence network was extensive, built over generations of dealing with outside authorities. There were Wright kinsmen working in businesses throughout the county seat, women who cleaned the boarding houses where officials stayed, men who worked in the stables where lawmen kept their horses. There were sympathizers who owed the clan favors, debtors who could be reminded of their obligations, and simply curious people who could be induced to share what they knew. Information flowed to John from dozens of sources, each piece adding to the picture he was building. Within 3 weeks, John had compiled dossiers on all 9 federal marshals operating in Letcher County, including Blackwood himself. He knew that Blackwood was staying at a boarding house in Whitesburg, that he took dinner each evening at the same restaurant, that he walked to and from the federal office without escort, despite the danger. He knew that Deputy Marshal Harrison was a drunk who could be found at one of 2 saloons most nights. He knew that Deputy Marshal Crawford had a wife in Virginia, who he visited once a month, traveling alone on roads that passed through remote territory. Every man had vulnerabilities, and John Wright catalogued them all. The question was timing. Striking too soon would give the Federals a chance to bring in reinforcements before the job was complete. Striking too late risked allowing Blackwood to use Billy's information to arrest clan members, weakening John's forces before the fight even began. The optimal moment would come when the Federals felt most secure, when they believed their tactics were working and their position was strong. That moment came in June, when Blackwood announced that he had secured indictments against 7 Wright clan members based on testimony from a confidential informant. The night before the warrants were to be served, John Wright set his plan in motion. The first federal marshal to die was Deputy Harrison, the drunk, killed as he stumbled out of a Whitesburg saloon just after midnight. The killer was never identified, though witnesses described a tall man in dark clothing who approached Harrison from behind and cut his throat with a single efficient motion. Harrison's body was left in the street, a note pinned to his chest that read simply, "Justice for the Wright clan, one of many." The town woke to horror, and the remaining marshals suddenly understood that they were at war. Marshal Blackwood responded exactly as John Wright had anticipated, ordering his remaining deputies to stay together, to travel in groups of no fewer than 3, to remain inside fortified positions whenever possible. These precautions made the marshals harder to reach, but also made them less effective. They could not enforce the law from inside a barricaded building, could not serve warrants while huddled together for mutual protection. The federal operation in Letcher County was paralyzed, and the indictments against the Wright clan members could not be executed. But John Wright was patient, and he understood that Blackwood's precautions could not last forever. The federal government would not tolerate indefinite paralysis of its operations, and Blackwood would eventually be forced to send his men out into the county. When that happened, John would be waiting. He established observation posts throughout the area, using clan members who could move through the mountains unseen, who could watch the federal offices without being detected, who could report any movement within hours of its occurrence. The second and third killings came 2 weeks later, when Blackwood finally succumbed to pressure from Washington and sent a team of 4 deputies to serve warrants in a remote section of the county. John's observers spotted the team leaving Whitesburg and tracked their progress through the mountains, relaying their position to John in real time. The ambush was set up at a narrow point in the trail, where the terrain limited the deputies' options for response, and when the shooting was over, 2 of the 4 men were dead. The other 2 fled back to Whitesburg, spreading terror that would make future operations even more difficult. The notes left with the bodies were more elaborate this time, explaining in detail why the Wright clan had declared war on the federal marshals. They described the tactics used to break Billy Wright, the threats against his wife and child, the torture and isolation that had destroyed his resistance. They challenged anyone who read them to say that such methods were acceptable, that a government which used them deserved anything but destruction. The notes were copied by newspapers and published throughout the state, and public opinion, which had initially condemned the killings, began to shift. That's right. The story of Billy Wright and the tactics used to break him struck a chord with people throughout Kentucky and beyond. Many families had sons or brothers who had run afoul of federal liquor laws, and the idea that those men might be subjected to torture and threats against their families was horrifying. Letters to editors began appearing in newspapers, some defending the Wright clan's response, others at least expressing understanding for their position. Politicians who had initially demanded federal action began to moderate their stance, unwilling to be associated with the methods Blackwood had employed. But the killings continued, regardless of public opinion. John Wright had sworn to destroy everyone who had participated in Billy's breaking, and he would not be swayed by newspaper coverage or political considerations. The 4th victim was found floating in the Kentucky River, shot through the head, another note attached to his body. The 5th was killed in his bed at the boarding house in Whitesburg, the killer somehow bypassing the guards that had been posted throughout the building. Each death demonstrated that the Wright clan could reach anyone, anywhere, regardless of the precautions taken against them. Marshal Blackwood requested reinforcements from Washington, and within 2 weeks, an additional 12 federal officers had been deployed to Letcher County. But this only expanded John Wright's target list. The new arrivals were not directly responsible for what had been done to Billy, but they had chosen to stand with those who were, and that was enough. The war continued, with killings occurring at unpredictable intervals, sometimes several in a week, and sometimes none for a month, keeping the federal forces in a constant state of tension and fear. The 6th victim was a young deputy who had arrived with the reinforcements, killed less than a week after reaching Kentucky. He had made the mistake of venturing out alone to visit a local woman he had befriended, and he paid for that mistake with his life. The 7th was one of the original deputies, a man who had personally participated in Billy's interrogation sessions. He was found in pieces, his body dismembered and scattered across a hillside as a message about what awaited those who tortured Wright clan members. The brutality of this killing shocked even those who had come to sympathize with the Wright cause. The federal response became increasingly desperate and increasingly counterproductive. Blackwood ordered mass arrests throughout Wright territory, bringing in anyone who might have information about John's whereabouts. But these arrests only strengthened the clan's support among the broader community, as families who had previously stayed neutral found their own members caught up in the federal dragnet. The jails in Whitesburg overflowed with prisoners who had committed no crime except being related to someone who was related to someone in the Wright clan. The injustice was obvious to everyone, and it pushed more and more people toward John Wright's side. By the fall of 1909, 10 federal marshals were dead, and the remainder were effectively confined to the immediate vicinity of Whitesburg. They could not venture into the countryside without risking ambush, could not trust any local person to provide accurate information, could not even guarantee their safety within the town limits. The federal operation in Letcher County had been destroyed, not by military force but by the relentless pressure of a single extended family that refused to submit. Thomas Blackwood, the man who had thought he could break the Wright clan, found himself trapped in a hell of his own making. And that's when Thomas Blackwood made the decision that would seal his fate and the fates of the men who still served under him. You see, Blackwood understood by October that his position was untenable. The federal government was losing patience with his failure. The newspapers were publishing increasingly critical coverage of his methods, and the body count continued to rise with no end in sight. He needed a victory, something dramatic that would justify the resources being expended and restore confidence in his leadership. And the only victory that would suffice was the capture or killing of John Wright himself. The plan Blackwood developed was simple in concept, but catastrophically flawed in execution. He would use Billy Wright, the informant whose cooperation had started this war, to lure John into a trap. Billy would arrange a meeting with John, ostensibly to plead for forgiveness, and offer to help the Klan destroy the federal operation from within. When John arrived at the meeting, Blackwood's men would be waiting, and the war would end with the death or capture of the Wright clan's leader. Billy Wright was brought back to Letcher County in chains, transported from the federal facility in Lexington, where he had been held since providing his testimony. He looked nothing like the young man who had been arrested 8 months earlier. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his spirit clearly broken by months of isolation and the knowledge of what his betrayal had cost. Blackwood explained the plan to him in simple terms: cooperate one more time, and everything would finally be over. Refuse, and the threats against his wife and daughter would be carried out. What Blackwood did not know was that Billy Wright had already made his decision. The months in federal custody had given him time to understand the full magnitude of what he had done, the blood that was on his hands, even though he had never pulled a trigger. He had betrayed his clan, had provided information that was now being used to hunt his own kinsman, had brought shame on his family that could never be erased. There was only one way to atone for what he had done, and Blackwood was unwittingly providing him the opportunity. Billy agreed to cooperate, playing his role perfectly, showing just enough reluctance to make his eventual compliance believable. He composed a message to John Wright, handwritten and delivered through channels that Blackwood believed were secure, requesting a secret meeting to discuss matters of urgent importance. The message included coded phrases that would have meant nothing to the Federals, but that would tell John everything he needed to know. Billy was warning his kinsman, was providing the information needed to turn Blackwood's trap against him. The meeting was set for a remote hollow deep in Wright territory, a location that Blackwood believed would give his men the advantage of surprise. 40 Federal officers were assembled for the operation, the largest force that had ever been deployed against a single individual in Kentucky history. They moved into position under cover of darkness, surrounding the hollow, blocking every escape route, confident that John Wright would walk into their trap and that this nightmare would finally end. John Wright did come to the meeting, but not in the way that Blackwood expected. He came with over 100 Wright clan members, all of them armed, all of them positioned throughout the surrounding hills before the federal force even arrived. The trap that Blackwood had prepared for John Wright had itself been trapped, and when the sun rose on that October morning, the federal marshals found themselves surrounded by enemies who knew every inch of the terrain and who had every advantage that mattered. The federal force had entered the hollow from the south, moving in a column that stretched for nearly a quarter mile along the narrow trail. They had posted scouts ahead and on the flanks, but those scouts had been quietly eliminated during the night by Wright kinsmen who had been waiting for them. The marshals believed they were approaching their objective undetected, but in reality, they were walking into a killing ground that had been prepared with meticulous care. The signal to attack was the call of a whippoorwill, repeated 3 times from the ridge to the east. Within seconds of that call, rifle fire erupted from every direction, a storm of lead that swept through the federal column with devastating effect. The marshals at the front of the column were killed almost instantly, caught in overlapping fields of fire that left them no chance to respond. Those in the middle tried to take cover, but there was no cover to be found in that carefully prepared kill zone. Blackwood screamed orders that no one could hear over the roar of gunfire, trying to organize some kind of response to an attack that had already succeeded. His men fired back blindly, aiming at muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared before they could draw a bead. Some tried to charge up the ridges toward their attackers, but they were cut down before they had climbed 10 feet. Others tried to retreat the way they had come, but they found the trail blocked by Wright kinsmen, who had circled behind them during the night. The Battle of Wright Hollow, as it came to be known, lasted less than an hour, but claimed more lives than any single engagement in Kentucky history since the Civil War. The federal forces were caught in a crossfire that they could not escape, their carefully planned ambush positions becoming death traps as Wright marksmen fired down on them from the ridges above. The sound of the shooting echoed through the mountains for miles, reaching the ears of people in Whitesburg, who would spend the rest of the day wondering what was happening in the wilderness. Some deputies tried to flee, but found their escape routes blocked by clan members who had circled behind them during the night. They ran into walls of gunfire that cut them down before they could even identify where the shots were coming from. Others tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands, calling out that they gave up, that they would accept any terms. But the Wright clan was not in a forgiving mood, not after what had been done to Billy, not after months of being hunted like animals. The men who tried to surrender died alongside those who continued to fight. Of the 40 federal officers who entered that hollow, only 12 emerged alive. Most of them were wounded, some so badly that they would never fully recover. They stumbled back toward Whitesburg in a ragged column, their weapons lost, their comrades dead, their confidence shattered beyond any hope of repair. The Battle of Wright Hollow had demonstrated that the federal government's power had limits, that there were places in America where that power could not reach, and that the Wright clan was capable of defending those places against any force that might be sent against them. Thomas Blackwood was among the dead, killed not in the initial engagement, but afterward, when John Wright personally entered the federal position to find the man who had started this war. Blackwood was wounded, but alive, his right leg shattered by a bullet, trying to crawl toward cover when John found him. According to the few survivors who witnessed the encounter, John stood over Blackwood for a long moment, looking down at the man who had tortured his kinsman and threatened innocent women and children to break his will. Then he spoke, the only words anyone heard him say during the entire battle. "This is for Billy," and then he did what he had come to do. Billy Wright died that day as well, though not at the hands of the Federals. He had insisted on accompanying John to the meeting, knowing that he would not survive the encounter regardless of its outcome. He fought alongside his kinsman for the first time since his arrest, acquitting himself with a courage that went some way toward erasing the shame of his betrayal. When a Federal bullet found him in the final minutes of the battle, he died with a smile on his face, knowing that he had done what he could to make things right. His body was carried from the hollow by his cousins and buried with full clan honors, his betrayal forgiven, if not forgotten. The aftermath of the Battle of Wright Hollow created a crisis that reached the highest levels of the federal government. 28 federal officers were dead, killed in a single engagement by civilians who refused to submit to federal authority. The political implications were enormous, with some calling for military intervention and others demanding that the government acknowledge its own role in creating the disaster. President Taft himself convened meetings to discuss the situation, acutely aware that the wrong response could trigger a wider conflict throughout the Appalachian region. The debate in Washington was heated and prolonged, lasting for weeks as various factions argued for different approaches. Some officials wanted to send the army into Letcher County to crush the Wright clan with overwhelming military force and establish once and for all that no group of citizens could challenge federal authority with impunity. They argued that anything less would invite similar resistance throughout the country, that lawlessness would spread if the government failed to respond decisively. Others cautioned against such a response, warning that military intervention in Kentucky would create martyrs and intensify resistance rather than suppressing it. They pointed to the public sympathy that the Wright clan had already gained, sympathy that had been building since news of Blackwood's interrogation methods became public. A military campaign that killed more mountain people would only strengthen that sympathy and might well provoke the very uprising that officials feared. There were also practical concerns about the feasibility of military action. The terrain of eastern Kentucky was notoriously difficult, as the recent events had demonstrated. An army division would have no easier time navigating those mountains than the federal marshals had, and the local population would be even more hostile after a military invasion. The Wright clan and its allies knew every hiding place, every ambush site, every route of escape. A military campaign could drag on for years without achieving its objectives. The decision that emerged from those meetings was pragmatic rather than principled. The federal government would quietly withdraw from Letcher County, would drop all charges against members of the Wright clan, and would pretend that the Battle of Wright Hollow had never happened. No official report would be filed, no investigation would be conducted, and the families of the dead marshals would be told that their loved ones had died in an accident during training exercises. The Wright clan had won, and the government's response was to bury the evidence and hoped that the story would eventually be forgotten. But John Wright was not finished. That's right, the Battle of Wright Hollow had eliminated the federal presence in Letcher County, but it had not accounted for everyone on John's list. Several deputies who had participated in Billy's torture had been away from the county during the battle, and John had sworn that every man responsible would pay the price. The vendetta that had claimed 12 lives before the battle would continue until the list was complete. Over the following months, John Wright hunted the surviving deputies across Kentucky and into neighboring states. He tracked them to new postings, to the homes of relatives where they had sought refuge, to distant cities where they believed they were safe. One by one, he found them, and one by one, they died. The pursuit was relentless, driven by the same cold determination that had characterized everything John Wright had done since learning of Billy's betrayal. The methods John used varied according to the circumstances of each target. Some he killed from a distance, using his legendary marksmanship to reach men who thought themselves protected by walls and guards. Others he approached directly, wanting them to see his face and understand why they were dying before he ended their lives. A few he took alive and questioned, extracting information about the locations of other survivors before disposing of them in ways that ensured their bodies would be found and their fates would serve as warnings. Deputy Carson was killed in Louisville, shot through a hotel window by a marksman who was never identified. He had been staying at one of the finest hotels in the city, believing that the crowds and the security would protect him. But John had spent 3 days observing the hotel, identifying Carson's room, and calculating the angles needed to make the shot. He fired from a rooftop 2 blocks away, the bullet traveling a path that seemed almost impossible, but that found its target with unerring precision. By the time anyone understood what had happened, John was already gone. Deputy Miller was found dead in a Virginia farmhouse, his throat cut in the same manner as the first victim all those months ago. He had fled to relatives in the Shenandoah Valley, people who had no connection to Kentucky and no reason to fear the Wright clan. But John's network extended further than anyone imagined, and word of Miller's location reached Kentucky within weeks of his arrival. John traveled east alone, found the farmhouse and waited until Miller was isolated before striking. The note left with the body continued the count that had begun with the first killing. Deputy Thompson disappeared entirely, his body never found, though everyone knew what had happened to him. He had been the most cautious of the survivors, never staying in one place for long, using false names and disguises, trusting no one. But his caution could not protect him from a hunter who would not give up, who had all the time in the world, who considered this pursuit a sacred duty. Thompson vanished from a boarding house in Cincinnati, leaving behind all his possessions and no clue about where he had gone. His fate remained officially unknown, but his family eventually stopped waiting for him to return. The pursuit took John Wright across 5 states over the course of 4 months, a journey of thousands of miles undertaken mostly on foot and horseback. He slept in barns and haystacks, in friendly homes and hostile wilderness, eating when he could and going without when he could not. The hardship seemed to affect him not at all, his focus on his objective absolute and unwavering. Each successful killing brought him closer to the end, and each successful killing demonstrated that nowhere was safe from the Wright clan's justice. The final killing came in February 1910, nearly a year after the vendetta began. Deputy James Whitfield had fled all the way to Texas, believing that distance would provide the protection that hiding had failed to offer. He had changed his name, grown a beard, taken a job on a ranch where no one asked questions about his past. He had begun to believe that he might actually survive, that John Wright could not possibly track him across thousands of miles to this remote corner of the country. He was wrong. John Wright traveled to Texas alone, following a trail of information that had taken months to compile. He found Whitfield working in the fields of the ranch, approached him in broad daylight and identified himself before firing. The note left with Whitfield's body was the last in the series. Justice for Billy Wright and the Wright clan. 18 of 18. It is finished. John Wright had kept his promise, had eliminated every man who had participated in his cousin's coercion, had demonstrated to the world what happened when the Wright clan was attacked. The vendetta was over. John Wright returned to Kentucky and resumed his life as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The journey home took 3 weeks, a leisurely pace that allowed him to cover his tracks and ensure that no pursuit was following. He entered Wright territory in early March, greeted by kinsmen who had been watching for his return since word of the final killing reached them. The prodigal hunter was welcomed back as a hero, though John himself showed little interest in celebration. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. The Wright compound had changed during his absence. Recovering from the tension and fear that had characterized the months of vendetta, the fields had been planted, the livestock tended, the normal rhythms of mountain life resumed. The federal withdrawal had removed the immediate threat, and the clan was beginning to look toward the future rather than constantly watching for danger. John's return completed the transition, signaling that the crisis was truly over and that the Wright clan had emerged victorious. Ezekiel Wright died 3 months after John's return, passing peacefully in his bed at the age of 93. He had lived long enough to see the threat to his clan defeated, long enough to know that his grandson would carry on the traditions he had spent his life protecting. His funeral was attended by over 500 people, representatives of every Wright family line, and dozens of allied clans who came to pay their respects to a man who had led his people for nearly half a century. John stood at his grandfather's grave and accepted the mantle of leadership that passed to him, becoming the patriarch of the Wright clan at the age of 29. The years that followed were remarkably peaceful by the standards of Wright family history. The federal government made no further attempts to challenge Wright authority in Letcher County, and other potential enemies took note of what had happened to those who had tried. John married a woman named Sarah from a neighboring clan in 1912, a union that strengthened alliances and began a family that would grow to 7 children over the following 2 decades. Each child was raised in the traditions of the clan, taught the skills and values that had sustained the Wrights for over a century. John proved to be an effective peacetime leader, guiding the clan through the changes that swept through Appalachia during the early 20th century. He negotiated with coal companies that sought access to Wright land, extracting terms far more favorable than those that other families had received. He maintained the clan's independence while adapting to new economic realities, finding ways to participate in the modern economy without sacrificing the autonomy that his ancestors had fought to preserve. Under his leadership, the Wright clan prospered in ways that it never had before. The Great Depression hit the mountains hard, but the Wright clan weathered it better than most. The skills of self-sufficiency that had sustained them for generations proved invaluable when the cash economy collapsed, and the clan's extensive landholdings provided food and shelter when others were going hungry. John organized assistance to neighboring families who were struggling, building goodwill that would pay dividends for years to come. His reputation grew from feared killer to wise leader, though no one ever forgot the events that had made him famous. He lived to be 83 years old, dying peacefully in his bed in 1964, surrounded by descendants who numbered in the hundreds. He never spoke publicly about the vendetta, never granted interviews to the journalists and historians who sought him out, never acknowledged the nickname that had followed him through life. Devil John Wright took his secrets to the grave. His funeral in 1964 was attended by over 1,000 people, representatives of every branch of the Wright clan and allied families from throughout the region. They came to honor a man who had defined an era, who had demonstrated what clan loyalty meant when put to the ultimate test. The pallbearers who carried his coffin to the family cemetery included his sons and grandsons, the next generations of Wright leadership. They lowered him into the ground beside his grandfather Ezekiel and his wife Sarah, in the cemetery that held the remains of Wright ancestors stretching back to the first settlers. A mountain preacher spoke words of comfort and remembrance, and the crowd sang the old hymns that had echoed through these hills for over a century. Then the family returned to their homes, and life continued as it always had. The story of Devil John Wright passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about him, ballads that celebrated his defiance and mourned the blood that had been spilled. Some portrayed him as a hero who had defended his family against tyranny. Others painted him as a monster who had slaughtered men for doing their jobs. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Devil John Wright story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, providing a musical record that could be passed from generation to generation. Others focused on particular aspects of the story, dramatizing the Battle of Wright Hollow or the final killing in Texas. The most famous of these songs, known simply as Devil John, was composed within months of the vendetta's end and has been recorded by dozens of artists over the past century. Academic interest in the Devil John Wright case began in the 1930s, when historians and sociologists started examining the clan structures that had characterized Appalachian life before the forces of modernization swept them away. John Wright's vendetta became a case study in clan loyalty and its consequences, analyzed from perspectives ranging from anthropological examination of kinship obligations to political science studies of resistance to state authority. Each generation of scholars brought new frameworks and new questions to the material. The government's decision to bury the story proved impossible to maintain over time. Survivors talked, journalists investigated, and eventually the full scope of what had happened in Letcher County became public knowledge. Congressional hearings in the 1920s examined federal law enforcement methods, with the Wright case cited as an example of tactics that had gone too far. These hearings led to reforms that, while imperfect, at least established some limits on what federal agents could do to uncooperative witnesses. The Wright clan itself became the subject of intense study by anthropologists and folklorists who sought to understand the social structures that had produced such fierce loyalty and such devastating response to betrayal. Researchers spent years embedded in Wright territory, interviewing elderly clan members who remembered the old ways, documenting traditions that were already beginning to fade. Their work preserved a record of a way of life that would soon become unrecognizable, transformed by highways and television and the economic forces that drew young people away from the mountains. You see, what John Wright did cannot be justified by any conventional moral framework, cannot be excused or explained away or fitted neatly into categories of right and wrong. He killed 18 men, some of whom had participated in his cousin's torture, and some of whom were simply federal officers doing their duty. He orchestrated a battle that claimed the lives of 28 more, men who had wives and children and families of their own. The violence he committed was devastating, and its consequences extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass everyone who loved them. And yet his story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of madness and murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that violence is wrong. He was a man whose kinsmen had been tortured by agents of the federal government, whose clan had been targeted for destruction by forces that recognized no limits on their power. The system that should have protected his family instead attacked them, using methods that violated every principle of justice and decency. What response could a society expect from a man so completely betrayed by the authorities who claimed to represent law and order? The methods that Marshal Blackwood used against Billy Wright would be illegal today, recognized as torture and coercion that no legitimate government can employ. But in 1909, there were few limits on what federal officers could do to extract information from uncooperative witnesses. The isolation, the starvation, the threats against family members were all considered acceptable tactics in the pursuit of federal objectives. John Wright's response was excessive by any measure, but the provocation was equally excessive, and history cannot judge one without acknowledging the other. The federal government never officially acknowledged what happened in Letcher County in 1909 and 1910. The deaths of the marshals were attributed to various accidents and illnesses, and the Battle of Wright Hollow was erased from official records entirely. But the story persisted in local memory, passed down through generations of mountain families who saw in John Wright's vendetta a validation of their own values and beliefs. The clan had been attacked, the clan had responded, and the clan had won. That was all that mattered. The Wright clan continued to dominate the upper Kentucky River Valley throughout the 20th century, their power waning only gradually as the old ways of the mountains gave way to modern economic and social forces. The last of John Wright's children died in 2012, taking with them the first-hand memories of a father who had killed 18 men in defense of family honor. But the story endures. retold by descendants who may not know all the details, but who understand the essential truth that it represents. The descendants of the Wright clan still live in those Kentucky hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and burden. Some have embraced the family legacy, researching the history and preserving the stories for future generations. Others have tried to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the violence that made their ancestors famous. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by events that occurred over a century ago, a vendetta that defined their family in ways that cannot be escaped or forgotten. The graves of those who died in the vendetta are scattered across the mountains, some marked and some forgotten, some honored and some deliberately obscured. Billy Wright lies in the family cemetery, his stone bearing his name and dates and nothing else, the story of his betrayal and redemption known only to those who already know it. Marshal Blackwood is buried in a federal cemetery in Virginia, his headstone identifying him only as a marshal who died in the line of duty, with no mention of the circumstances that led to his death or the methods that provoked his killing. The hollow where the great battle took place is overgrown now, the positions where men fought and died reclaimed by the forest that covers everything in these mountains eventually. Local people still avoid the place, claiming that the spirits of the dead are restless. That strange sounds can be heard on October nights when the wind is right. Whether this is true or merely the kind of story that attaches to places where terrible things have happened, it adds another layer to the legend that has grown around Devil John Wright and the vendetta he waged. The mountains of Letcher County remain today much as they were in 1909, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear, the trees still change color each autumn, the hollows still shelter families whose names have been associated with this land for generations. Federal agents still occasionally pass through, but they do so with a caution born of historical memory, aware that the people they encounter carry traditions of resistance that have never been entirely abandoned. The story of Devil John Wright endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of clan loyalty, and what that loyalty becomes when it is tested beyond all reasonable limits. It is the story of government power, and the consequences of wielding that power without restraint or accountability. It is the story of vengeance and its terrible costs, both to those who suffer it and to those who inflict it. It is, finally, a story without heroes or villains, only humans caught in circumstances that reveal both the best and worst of what we are capable of becoming. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Devil John Wright stood, to see the hills he defended and the hollow where so many men died? Would you walk the paths that his kinsmen walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hollows since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy, the roads are narrow and winding, and the places where the story happened are not marked on any tourist map. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that hollow and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Devil John Wright close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. His story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Letcher County in 1909, as long as clans protect their own, with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as governments overreach and people find ways to resist. He is gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the hills he loved. But what he did and what was done to his family echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of Devil John Wright, who killed 18 federal lawmen after they made him turn against his own clan. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of torture and vengeance, of the limits of government power and the price of pushing men too far. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.